Hey guys, just a small video, not really tutorial, but well, I guess it is a tutorial if I'm explaining. But I'm explaining all the hoo-ha that you'll hear about frames per second. You'll see just a whole bunch of people saying, I record at this many frames per second, and my final render will be this many frames per second. Why are these guys, rendering at recording at like 1,000 frames per second? Is that really necessary? And what's the whole point behind it? So, like I said before, the basic frames per second in which most movies are recorded at, or TV shows are recorded at, is 30 frames per second. You'll see, NTSC, which is American, that's 23.976 frames per second, which is also what the TF2 replay system records at. You have PAL, which is 29.97 frames per second, I believe. And those are just the normal, you watch a video and that's what the frames per second would be. However, with a lot of recent movies, a lot of people like to make their final movie 60 frames per second, with monitors having a refresh rate of 60 Hertz. They want to utilize the fact that you can have 60 frames per second running, and that makes the overall image quality run much smoother than it would be for 30 frames per second. If you think about it, if you have 1 second of footage and you got 30 images inside it, it will run. Just think of kind of like a flip book with 30 pages. It will be that smooth. Now, if you have 60 frames per second, of course, there'll be more images. Like, you'll have more pictures, to go in between each image. If you know what I mean, from getting to 1 second to 2 seconds, the more images you have in between, the smoother it would be, logically. And in the case of real life, normal cameras can't really can't record at such high footage, at such high frame rates. But then with the advent of the new extreme slow-mo cameras that you'll see, which records at like 1,000 frames per second, I think, you see all those slow motion sports action and all that crap. So that's just to get that out of the way. In game for TF2, you can record up to as much frames per second as you want, as is reasonable. Just what is in the frames of reasonable, recording amount. If you're going to be making your final movie at 60 frames per second, you want to choose a initial recording frame per second that is a multiple of 60, so 120, 180, 240, 300, up and up and up. Because what you're going to be doing is that, when you finally render it, it will be like a good solid, division of frames into each second. It's kind of complicated to explain for me, but you kind of get what I'm saying when I show you a couple of pictures. So what I've got is that clip that I recorded just before, in 60 frames per second, and in the 240 frames per second that I had shown you that I recorded. So if I make my Sony Vegas have a project frame rate of 60 frames per second, you see that this layer right here, which is 60 frames per second, every single frame that I go along will be one picture, because for every second, Sony Vegas has allotted 60 frames per 1 second. Now, if I were to have the original 240 frames per second, you'll see that it actually gets a bit blurry, because now I've got 240 images to pack into a 1 second slot of 60 images. So what Sony Vegas does is that for every frame, it actually gets the 4 frames and merges it or blends it into one frame, and therefore for every one frame you actually have 4 frames of footage from the game. And what this allows is for a really good natural motion blur type effect, without having to use an external motion blur plugin, which can really mess up with certain HUD elements like the crosshair. So the higher the frame rate is, the more images it will blend into one frame. So in this case, we have 4 frames per second. An advantage of recording at a high frame rate is also the ability to do a couple of slow motion clips. So if I were to make this really slow, say if I were to slow this down by 2 times, now for every second I've stretched it into 2 seconds. Now if I were to do this with my 60 frames per second clip, it wouldn't actually work, because now I've taken 60 frames per second and stretched it out over 2 seconds. So instead of 60 frames in 60 frames, it's now 60 frames over 120 frames. So what it would actually be is quite choppy. The advantage of having something that's 240 frames per second is that you have the ability to spread it out. But if you have 240 frames per second, you can stretch that out to 2 seconds and still have 120 frames per second, and therefore it's still smooth. And if you think about it, if you record at 480 frames per second and you stretch it out by 2 times, you're gonna have a lot of frames per second remaining for the slow motion action. And that's pretty much the crux of why a lot of people like to record at high FPS, because 1, slow motion looks really, really good, and 2, it just gets the natural motion blur effect, which gives you really, really nice smooth movement. And yeah, that's the main reason for the whole hoo-ha between I record at 480 frames per second. I personally record at 200 frames per second and produce my final movies at 50 frames per second. I don't know why, I've just got this thing with even numbers, and I think 50 is a sweet number to work at. Naturally, I should work at 300 frames per second, because that gives you the ability to make your final render at 30 frames per second, which is what YouTube videos run at. 60 frames per second, in which a lot of people like to upload for people that are quality freaks, and 50 frames per second for people like me, and the ability to avoid Special K's -1 for 60 FPS critique. So that's the end of my explanation for frames per second. I hope that clears a lot of questions in people's minds, and I'll just see you next time.